I said, Kevin Twit, who is the founder of Indelible Grace and a minister with RUF at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm just going to hand it over to you, Kevin. Can you sort of give us your story? Who are you?
Who am I? I actually grew up in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
I was telling you that, and till I went off to college, and then kind of been all over the place. I was christened as a Lutheran, so I'm kind of a denominational mutt of sorts, Presbyterian minister now. I guess, Indelible Grace, I like to describe it as flowing out of some of the convictions that RUF has. RUF is the denominational college ministry of the Presbyterian Church in America. And one of the things that is distinctive as compared to some parachurch kinds of ministries is ordained campus ministers. And I think that because of that, there's probably more attentiveness to the long-term spiritual condition of the people that come through our ministry. So what I would say is when I first was exposed to RUF, they were already trying to sing hymns and scripture songs and preaching a full kind of sermon, which my background in campus ministry in various different groups I've been with in college, that was rather unusual. But to them it was important because their conviction that worship is formative and pastors should attend to the kinds of songs that we sing. As we talked a little earlier, that sometimes, some of the songs maybe can undermine even some of the gospel messages that we're trying to preach to people. Sometimes just because of what they don't say, sometimes because of what they do say. And so, that was already kind of a culture in RUF. Had a background in music. I went to Berklee College of Music, and then I moved down to Nashville, was working as a recording engineer, went off to seminary. When I came back from seminary is when I, kind of this movement was beginning in a lot of ways. And the first one I wrote, actually the first hymn tune I wrote was that one we just did, Rise My Soul Rise. And it was at a kind of a renewal conference at a retreat center in North Carolina. And the guy who led the meeting had us try to sing that hymn, and it didn't really, the tune that was in our hymnal didn't really seem to fit the mood of it, and it was more dirge-like, and I thought, wow, the words are so great, but it would be nice to have a tune that seemed to fit the mood. And that's very subjective, of course.
And you've told me you've since slowed it down. We played a little bit faster.
Sometimes, yeah, depending on the context. If there's a more multi-generational group, then sometimes a little slower can make it more easy to sing, I think, especially some of the syncopated rhythms. But that's, you got to get to know your congregation and find that.
One of the things I love about Kevin is the stories that he tells along with the hymns. Can you just talk a little bit about the story behind Rise My Soul?
Yeah, oh yeah, you mean like Charles Wesley's text?
Yeah,
that's a great story. Charles Wesley got lots of letters from his, when he would write hymns, and people would write him letters. There's a guy, Bruce Hindmarsh, teaches at Regent College up in Vancouver, who discovered a notebook that Charles Wesley had taken these letters and pasted them into this notebook. And he got more letters of people tracing their conversion to that hymn than any other hymn that he wrote. It's not in the Methodist hymnal anymore. So when I found that in a Presbyterian hymnal and retuned it, it's actually a communion hymn, which is pretty interesting.
And you just recently discovered that, right?
I've more recently, I met a man named Lester Ruth, who's a worship professor at Duke. And he's president of the Charles Wesley Society, and he had told me, how did you find this Wesley hymn, Rise My Soul Rise? I think it's one of Wesley's best hymns, but the Methodists haven't had it in their hymn book for 100 years. I said, well, the Presbyterians still have it in theirs. And so we found it and have been singing it for a while. And I think that one has gotten a lot of use in churches because it's an up-tempo song, but it's also substantive. And it's hard sometimes to, you start with worship, and sometimes the worship songs, like the worship leader is like way up here at this high spiritual pitch, and nobody else is there yet, and some of the songs aren't really giving us good reason to be there. But that's one that really calls us to focus on who God is, and even more particularly, Christ crucified at the table. It's pretty interesting to think of it that way. But Indelible Grace started basically just trying to, find some other songs to sing. And some of these texts that we were finding, there weren't tunes for them.
Right.
They were from old hymnals, and they dropped out of use. We weren't ever trying to deconstruct church music and retune hymns that had perfectly serviceable tunes that people were using. I think some people have misunderstood that. But some of the tunes that we wrote, I didn't know that people were singing those hymns, because I'd found them in other
You found them as
contexts.
a text.
Yeah, and I was in a church where we had already given up singing hymns. We were only singing modern songs. So there was no going back as far as musical style. But I really wanted to find a way to sort of bring the past and connect it to sort of our authentic musical voice with my students. And one of the good things about college ministry is it's easier to introduce change and new ideas than in most churches. So, I could literally hand out a hymn text on a Xerox piece of paper at my Sunday school class and say, let's try this to this tune. And somebody write a tune for it this week and come back and we'll try it with your tune next week. You can never do that in a church, really.
We've always done this way the last 4 years.
You have. Yeah, that's what you would get. Yeah, that's right. So college ministry is good. It's a great kind of place to experiment with the church that's coming. In some ways. So that, I think that was kind of unusual. And then I had a background in recording engineering. So we made this CD because we gathered a bunch of these songs in 2000, hoping the church basically advanced us enough money to press 1,000 copies. We were hoping that we would be able to recoup that money and pay them back. And it just hit a nerve in a way that really surprised us. And since then, I've really kind of been trying to figure out why.
Do you have... What are your thoughts on why it's hitting a nerve? It certainly hit a nerve with me.
I found a sign in an antique store one time that said, my grandmother saved it, my mother threw it away, and now I'm buying it back.
Say that again.
My grandmother saved it, my mother threw it away, and now I'm buying it back. I think a lot of things were sacrificed by the baby boomers in the pursuit of being relevant to the culture. And I think their children have wanted to connect to something that seems more rooted and not ephemeral. Honestly, those are the students I work with, and if you let them choose the songs, they want to sing songs about suffering. They want songs that speak to the real issues. They're worried that Christianity is just something that's been marketed to them or told to them as something that's cool, and it's really helpful to sing a song written by somebody 300-400 years ago and find that their understanding of God and the gospel is the same as ours.
And I love that a lot of the songs that you've reintroduced or worked with do touch on suffering and lament.
Yeah.
I love that because I'm a pessimist and in touch with my suffering. But one complaint that I have heard is, some of these songs are really, they're great for Lent. So it's sort of, have you heard that kind of complaint, and what kind of reaction?
Man, some, not as much, not from young people. I don't get that from young people. I think that, the best situation, you don't want to just sing hymns, right? I think, there's lots of good songs out there. But I do think, I'm not just trying to pick songs that people like. As I said at the luncheon message, I'm trying to pick songs that prepare my students for their encounter with death. And I don't know, these are the kind of songs that will help you die. John Wesley was asked one time why the Methodist movement spread so quickly. His simple answer, our people die well. In a day and age when people died at home, with their friends and family around them,
there's contrast to maybe more sort of optimism, kind of just constant sort of praise and.
So I think there's a big paradigm shift in thinking about worship. A lot of people tend to think of it as emoting before God, and I think, and certainly the Episcopal tradition, as I understand it, is dialogue, right? And that's the historic Christian tradition. God speaks. We start with a call to worship, and then we have the invocation. We say, "Help," right? Send your Spirit, and then God speaks, and we respond, and there's that back and forth, right? And I think in a lot of modern worship settings, we've lost that, and people think of worship as the time where we just get to sing and tell God what we feel. And I would rather, I hope that we can recapture some of the idea that worship is formative, and therefore we need to be filling our hearts with Christ and Him crucified. And there should be some content to that. I'm going to talk tomorrow about, in Colossians where Paul says, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs so that the word of Christ, the word about Christ, can dwell in you richly. And Yeah, those are the kind of songs. So my goal has always been, I don't want to, you can't just sing songs that people hate, but I do want to sing songs for more than just the fact that people like them, right? And that's trying to find the balance. And there's a lot, like even some of the songs we're going to sing tonight are ones that we don't use anymore. So you throw things out there, and some of them stick, some of them don't. But then you come to a church in Birmingham, and one of the ones that doesn't stick with us, and it's like it's always that way. Yeah. Some church, it's like their favorite song, and I was like, I don't think that one really worked very well, but it did for somebody.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, that's okay. No, it's great. That's kind of part of the jazz of it. You just never know when you create something what's going to happen with it.
So I have a question that I don't want to slip away. If these songs help us die, what songs will be at your funeral?
Well, probably "Dear Refuge of My Weary Soul." I think that would be a great one.
You talked about.
We talked about that
sermon earlier today.
That's right. I don't know. Well, there's a song that's not a hymn called "All My Tears" by a buddy of Julie Miller that I just love to death. I don't know if anybody knows that song.
What are some of the lines?
It don't matter where you bury me.
I'll be home.
I'll be home and I'll be free. It's kind of an Appalachian song. I don't know. It's a cool song. You should find it. Track it down.
And your most recent project is Joy Beyond the Sorrows, which seems to be in touch with these kind of minor keys or minor themes of life. Can you unpack that a little bit? Talk about that project?
Yeah. So I think, all these projects, they're not so, it's not like a high concept to them. It's when I have a combination of some time, some songs, and enough money to put together the next project, that's when we get to do it.
Right.
And that tends to happen every couple of years. But that one, a theme definitely emerged, and it was joy beyond the sorrow. In other words, the sorrow is real. Isaiah 5 says, woe to those woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And I think sometimes we can so elevate the sovereignty of God that we, in effect, do that. And I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that suffering is real, and it's here, and it's present. And yet it's not ultimate in the sense that there's a day coming when God will wipe away every tear. So how the already not yet, I guess what you call ordinary time, that's where we live most of the year, in that already not yet. And how are there songs to help us steward that time? And it's not by pretending that the sorrow is not real, but it's also not losing sight. Like whenever we celebrate the Lord's Supper, right? We remember his death as we do it now, proclaim his death until he comes again. And I think the song should do that same kind of thing.
It's almost, if you don't have the joy, if it's just sorrow, it's nihilistic. Would you say that that's true? I mean, you have to go there and be in touch with the sorrow.
Psalm 88 ends, darkness is my closest friend. And it ends. Yeah. There is a place for that.
There's the whole Psalter.
There is. There's a place for that in biblical canon. But I don't know if you get through that just in the time that it takes to sing one song.
Right.
So I think, I wouldn't want to say that we can't stay in Psalm 88. Isaac Watts, for instance, translated 133 of the 150 Psalms. He didn't do Psalm 88. Huh. He said that he basically said it was too Jewish and he couldn't get Christian joy into it. I think that was a mistake.
Wow.
I think it was a mistake. And Ann Steele, who I talked about today, is the first hymn writer to write real laments. And her hymns crossed denominational lines quicker than Watts or Wesley because it referenced the Psalms. It sort of spoke the spirit of the Psalms. And I think met people where they are. So I would never tell people that they need to get out of Psalm 88 too quickly, but to recognize that's part of the Christian life, but it's not all of it. Right. And there's a place even of communing with Christ in his sufferings, even in that place. What did it mean for Jesus to sing Psalm 88? Or Psalm 22, right, which we think he sang from the cross, which then echoes, you find these echoes in Psalm 23. Anyway, I think all that stuff I've just been enriched in my understanding of the fullness of the gospel. And what did it feel like for Jesus to love us? It felt really hard, So even people that are in the midst of that, they can find a place, even a place to connect with what it felt like for Jesus to love his people.
One person that you talk about a lot is Ann Steele. Can you talk a little bit more about her and her background? Yeah,
so she's an 18th century English hymn writer. If you're a fan of Downton or Jane Austen movies, she very much comes across like one of those characters. There's been a lot of apocryphal stories about her. It's a story like that her fiance drowned the day before her wedding, and she never did marry and was an invalid. Some of that's true, but not the wedding story. She actually got quite a few wedding proposals, and she turned them all down. Her dad was a pastor. She knew what it would be like to be a pastor's wife, and she felt like she would rather, work on her poetry and hang out in the drawing room.
Ones proposing to her?
Yeah, some of these pastors were proposing to her. Some of them were good hymn writers. But she had there's a whole book about her and the literary circle of friends it's very much like, her dad was wealthy. He was a timber merchant and also a Baptist pastor. And she was well educated, which was pretty unusual for the Baptists of that period. If you were a nonconformist, you couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge at that period, right? But she and her sister were well educated, and she was quite skilled. She struggled a lot with assurance. There's a difference between being a Christian and feeling confident that you're a Christian. I deal with a lot of students growing up in the South who've been made to feel like if they're not 100% sure, then they have no right to think they're a Christian. I have one kid, the youth pastor told him that one time. If you're 99% sure, you're 100% lost. Well, I think that's dreadful theology and unbiblical. And I think Ann Steele's hymns are really helpful in even kind of sort of teasing out the difficulty of coming to assurance. And our assurance can kind of ebb and flow even when God's love for us doesn't. So that's one of the things I think is really helpful about her hymns.
And you're a pastor, and
Yeah.
there's a pastoral element to what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about your pastoral reasons
That is the reason. Yeah, I never set out to really, like, the hymns are a means to an end for me and even making these CDs are a means to an end of trying to get the gospel not just into people's heads but into their hearts. I have a pastor friend and mentor named Scotty Smith who talks about the importance not only of knowing the lyrics to the gospel, but hearing the music. And Augustine said that he who sings prays twice. That music intensifies whatever we're doing, whether it's lament or praise. I'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. But it's always about pastoring. It's always about using every means possible to get the gospel into our hearts. In a beautiful, there's a friend of mine who's passed away now, but he used to regularly pray at the beginning of times of worship, Lord, make Jesus more beautiful and believable to us. And that's what we're trying to do. And I want songs that are displaying Christ in his beauty. And I think the ultimate beauty of Christ is seen at the cross.
Can you give some words of advice to a captive audience who might be interested in, who are a part of a church, who might be interested in bringing in this type of music, this genre of retuning old hymns or things within that?
Well, you got to start with where you are. And you probably would be wise to gather maybe a committee of people, which involves older and younger, being able to talk about what it is that they value in worship. Because I find a lot of times the worship wars are people talking within their own circles about each other. And that would be one thing. And then it depends. Like if it's a church that's already using a lot of hymns, you got to see maybe they could use some more lament hymns. And there are not as many in the hymn books as there used to be. Some of the tunes that we've done might be helpful to them, a way to sing some hymn texts they'd like to sing. Some of them might musically be an easier entry point. I don't really think there's probably any church that could do every song we've done on Indelible Grace CDs. And we've tried to have such a stylistic variety that it probably wouldn't fit any one congregation very well. But then for other churches, they might be really into, big rock band, high-powered worship, and you have to know why you're trying to do it. You don't want to just introduce new songs for the heck of it. So if you're trying to get the cross more centered, in your worship, there's some songs that would fit that high-volume rock and roll sound that we've done that would get the cross back in there. But maybe you're a church that, you do a lot of hymns, but you want to sort of have music maybe that's a little more modern sounding, you might find some. So I'd say listen to a lot of the stuff. That live CD that we did is a good starting point to hear what we've done.
So I'll just hold that up. This is which is for sale, by the way.
So we did.
I forget to say this is from the hymn saying of the Ryman. So talk about
about 10 years after we made the first CD, we ended up being able to have him sing at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville. It helped that our denominational national meeting was there, and it was directly across the street.
And they all knew
And
the songs.
yes, and RUF rented the Ryman for us, right? So all those things, perfect storm, came together, and my wife had the great idea to videotape it. So there's actually a movie of this too that's on YouTube. You can watch it for free. Roots and Wings, the story of Indelible Grace and the area of hymns. But what I like about this is you can hear how these songs are used in worship. There were 2,000 people there, old and young alike, and you can hear them singing together. When we made that first CD 10 years ago, a lot of people were upset at the musical style, and we can talk about the musical style issues. I would just say, from my reading of the letter to the Galatians, I think we ought to be very careful about thinking there's one pure cultural expression of the gospel. And there's lots of ways that we can fall into that. I think there are different musical cultural expressions. And as I read the end of Revelation, we're going to have people from every race, tribe, tongue, and nation, praising God, and the kings of the earth bringing their glory, bringing their splendor into the heavenly city. So somehow we've got to be careful about not just having a monocultural experience in our worship. And but when I first did this, this stuff, there was a lot of complaints about that.
Right.
10 years later, some of those songs had sunk their way into people's hearts in a way that it was remarkable to see people who had written me nasty letters 10 years later finding that maybe there was some helpful things. And I think the young people singing, when you come to a conference and you see like your college students, singing their hearts out, these kind of rich hymns, then maybe it gives you
There's
pause.
something happening
here. Yeah, you pause. But again, I understand that we've retuned some people's favorite hymns. Some of it I didn't know, and I didn't mean to, and I'm sorry. And I really am not saying you should retune hymns for the heck of it. I'm trying to find hymn texts that have fallen out of use that I think would be useful.
Yeah, like Amazing Grace and like A Mighty Fortress might be a bad idea.
Right,
yeah.
But except Amazing Grace is sung in a different tune in England.
Right.
So we get so married to certain tunes and think they're the quote-unquote original tunes.
Right.
Very rarely is that the case.
Yeah, I noticed that.
And we don't sing A Mighty Fortress like it was written either.
Right. The film Amazing Grace, if you watch that, he's singing it in a totally different tune. The first time I was like, what is this?
The English tune, the tune they sing in English is different. And it dropped out of the hymnals for a while until it got picked up here. Yeah. So a lot of hymns have undergone changes, and people kind of hold them up as sacred things that can't be changed.
Right.
But there's some changes that have been really good.
In this sort of genre of retuning old hymns, Indelible Grace certainly stands out as, if not the most popular, one of the most popular movements.
Right.
Who are some other people that you're excited about right now who are doing things with music that we ought to know about?
Wow. Boy, there's a lot of cool stuff. I mean, some of it's connected to us. So Sandra McCracken.
Like top 3, 4.
Yeah, Sandra McCracken has done a couple records, and she's part of our project, but she's also branched out on her own. The Bifrost Arts stuff is really cool.
Say a little bit more about who Bifrost is.
Bifrost came out of RUF too. A guy up in Connecticut, and then Isaac Wardell was friends of his, and they've done some other projects. They're in Charlottesville, Virginia now at a PCA church there. So they're not doing as many retuned hymns. They're even doing like pieces of service music, within a more traditional liturgy and different things. But honestly, there's a conference I was at not too long ago called Doxology and Theology that was, about 500 people, mostly under 30, who are writing some really great modern songs, words and music, that are full of gospel stuff. Good stuff. So there was a lot of people like Matt Papa and Matt Boswell and just Sojourn Church up in Louisville. There's really a lot of this stuff going on.
Talk to us about Rain for Roots and what connection you have to that.
Right. Well, I know all those girls. There's 4 girls, right, who are part of our community. 4 ladies. Yeah, sorry. I knew them when they were college students, so sorry. 4 ladies now with their own kids. They had really been impacted by Sally Lloyd-Jones, the Jesus Storybook Bible, and then found that there was another book, right? Was it the Hug a Bible?
Mm-hmm.
That was for
basically based on the...
the and so they went to Sally and they were like, we would like to set these poems, which is what all those chapters were, to music and make this recording, and they did, and it was beautiful.
And that's a great example of, that's a genre of music that often can set my teeth on edge,
Yes, children's music, yeah, that's right. Because it
And,
can be real
actually,
moralistic.
and I can listen to that without my daughters in my
Yeah.
car
Yeah.
and forget that it's children's music.
Yeah, that's right. And children's hymns, some of them are really dreadful too.
Right.
Yeah.
But Rain for Roots is...
Rain for Roots is a cool
stellar.
thing. Yeah. And there's just so much stuff. A friend of mine, Bruce Benedict, runs a website called Cardophonia, and he keeps track of lots of independent worship projects done by churches all over. And he cataloged, since we made our first Indelible Grace CD, 1,000 retuned hymns.
Wow.
So a lot of it is grassroots, and it'd be hard to find it unless you have like a curator like Cardophonia to find it. It's not necessarily the most popular stuff, but I have seen people really grab hold of it, and it really impact them in huge ways.
I'll ask you two more questions.
Okay.
What do you think the future holds for what you're doing personally and for this movement of music in the church?
Right. I think recently the scholarly community has started to get interested in it, which seems about right after about 10 or 15 years that they kind of pick up on it. So, I'm a member of the Hymn Society, and the latest issue of the Hymn, which is their journal, had a 10-page article on the Retuned Hymn movement.
Wow.
And they invited some of us to present a Retuned Hymn festival at their annual conference summer before last. I've been invited next year to go be a kind of a musician in residence at Baylor for their church music program. So I'm seeing some more of that sort of thing, which I think is good, because I think it would be good for the maturity of the movement to interact with more people outside of our little circle. I've also been trying to get more cross-cultural expressions. I had a guy recently give me about 75 Spanish translations of Indelible Grace hymns that I was able to put up on our website. And I've got another guy who's going to give me about 40 or 50 Chinese translations. But then also, I've been trying to even set some in a more black gospel music style. I'm always trying to, here's what I would say. Learn from this idea, but don't necessarily just do these songs.
Yeah.
Like, you've got to figure out who you are and how you could incarnate this idea. The heart of the idea is roots and wings. Wanting to help our young people be rooted in the tradition, but add their own voice. So it's neither traditionalism, or it's not throwing out the tradition and just creating all the things, but finding a way to bring those together. And yet, different congregations are going to do that in a different way. So rather than just say, you have to do all these songs and do them like we did with our arrangements, that has a lot to do with the musicians we have and the instrumentation we have. But take the idea. Go look through these old hymnals yourself. I love to give old hymnals to musicians and songwriters, because I know even if they don't write a good tune, they're going to be meditating on those texts.
Tell us, I love the name Indelible Grace.
Right.
Tell us, this is the last question before we'll transition into some
comes
music.
from a hymn. Comes from a hymn.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we were trying to figure out what would be a good name for that first CD. And somewhere along the line, I just hit on the idea of looking for a sort of a piece of a hymn text that was on the record. And there's one, my name is Augustus Toplady hymn. Toplady wrote Rock of Ages. Yes, and this is a great example of a hymn change that was a good one. He originally wrote When My Eye Strings Break in Death. When My Eye Strings Break in Death. Which is basically a tendon that snaps when you dries out and then your eye rolls back.
Wow.
It's not a great image. And George Whitefield changed it to When My Eyes Shall Close in Death. And that's a good change. Yeah. So, for those that think that hymns should never be changed, they should sometimes.
That'll keep that.
Yeah. Well, he wrote another one called A Debtor to Mercy Alone, of covenant mercy I sing. And it has a line, my name from the palms of his hands, eternity will not erase. Impressed on his heart it remains in marks of indelible grace.
Such a great line.
Yeah, and it actually comes from the book of Isaiah. One of the things that the Baal worshipers would do is carve the name Baal into their palms. And Isaiah, God through Isaiah takes that image and turns it around. Instead of you having to carve the name of your God, wound yourself so that you would never forget who you serve.
He does it.
He does it. Yeah.
And I always think of the indelible ink.
Yeah.
In other countries that they have to put on their thumbs when people vote.
Oh, when they vote, and then and they can't.
And it doesn't leave you. It
Yeah.
sticks with you.
Yeah. So I love that text. Good.
We're going to transition into to a couple more songs, and the next one is "I Asked the Lord." So can you talk to us about that song, and then we'll sing it?
Yeah, that's one that for years I just would take that text and I would hand it to students, because John Newton in his letters, which I highly recommend to anybody, the letters of John Newton, said that that a maturing Christian is somebody who often feels like God has abandoned them. That new Christians, God often gives them sort of extra feelings because they don't know anything. But at some point he wants to draw them to a deeper place. And often it's by withdrawing his presence. The Puritans were big on sort of understanding that dynamic as well. Well, that song, I would use that text a lot of times to try to talk to students about that, because I found a lot of them were maybe in that stage, but they were still trying to get back to a mountaintop experience they had in junior high camp, and thought that that's what maturity was. And if John Newton's right, he's the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, so we like that hymn. I don't know if you trust him on this, but I think he's right, that that's more of a state of immaturity that God wants sometimes to get us beyond. William Cooper, who was part of the Only Hymns, from which this book, or this hymn, I Asked the Lord, came from, wrote another wonderful hymn called "Sometimes a Light Surprises the Christian While He Sings." Sometimes. Not all the time, every time, right? And I think that's important. Again, when you sing a song, you're modeling for people what the normal Christian life feels like. Don't lie to them, okay? So, this one, "I Asked the Lord that I might grow," it's strong medicine. And a girl finally put that text to music, to a tune that we felt like worked pretty well. And it came out of this hymn book that John Newton and William Cooper were going to write together, and then William Cooper was struck with insanity and didn't finish. And there's a line in the hymn that we're going to sing that says, "It seemed that the Lord had crossed my fair design." That same phrase shows up in the preface to the hymn book, where Newton says, "It seemed that the Lord had crossed our fair design." We planned to write this group of hymns. I mean, Cooper was the poet laureate of England, and he wants to write hymns for the church. And then he's struck down with insanity and can't complete his part of the project. And Newton said he almost set the thing aside and didn't finish it, but finally decided to pick it up again. And so it's a pretty amazing hymn. I'll tell you one more story. I had a student who told me the first time she ever came to an REF meeting was one of our conferences, and there were 500 students singing that hymn. And this is a girl who had been, burning herself, all kinds of self-destructive stuff, suicidal, thoughts a lot, struggling a lot. And she said she'd grown up, her dad was a pastor, and she said, the first time she saw 500 of her peers singing that hymn, it was like life to her soul. And you would think, well, it's kind of a dark song. But for her to say, "Here's 500 of my peers, I'm not the only one that feels like this."
Right. It's a great example.
She'd say it saved her life.
Great example of what we were talking about before. So let's
try it.
Let's stand and join in singing "I Ask the Lord."
Salvation, Lord, send
thank you so much for being here tonight. I've been a
Thank
huge
you.
fan for years, so it's just an honor to sit here and talk to you and spend the day with you. And thank you so much to Glenn Lewis, our music director, and to our band tonight.
Hold on.